I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory in Camrose, about an hour southeast of Edmonton. And I actually spent my summers growing up in Saskatchewan, so I was almost like, I wonder if any of my relatives will be on this call. You never know, the world is small, but I spent a lot of summers near Strongfield, Outlook, Elbow, swimming lessons on Diefenbaker Lake. So yeah, Saskatchewan's near and dear to my heart. So it's always good to start with acknowledgements. And so I'm here presenting, and I'm presenting on research. You're going to see that data that were collected like also a long time ago, but that we're still working with to this day. The project, the Ecological Recovery Monitoring Project, that this work that I'm going to talk to you about today is related to a project that I started with back in 2012 when I was working with Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute in their application center. And so we had, it was not just me. I came from a PhD focused on mountain pine beetle and was like, okay, I grew up in Alberta. Let's talk more about what's happening with reclamation. And so just want to acknowledge all the team members. You can see the project team members there, as well as the field crew teams who collected the data that we're going to talk about today. And also there's been a lot of additional things that opportunities we've leveraged with the data, including looking at plant traits. So I want to also acknowledge the contributors there, and of course all the funding that goes into this research, because we know field research is not cheap. And also want to acknowledge Tracy Kopchenko from the Alberta Environmental AER Regulatory Board because we did a presentation at the North Dakota Reclamation Conference 3 years ago now, I think, and we did it together. And so some of she's got some great visuals from her work being based down in the grassland. So I'll talk about a little bit about where I'm contextualizing it. But as you heard in the introduction, I focus on plants. I also do some soils, but less so. So I'm presenting to agrologists and appreciating that the soils are the center of the universe, literally, but also that the plants rely on them. And so I often will focus on the plants and then try to look at what soil properties might impact them. So actually nowadays I'm spending a lot more time in the forests than in the grasslands, but also appreciating the value. I don't need to tell this audience just how important those grasslands are, and also the ease with which I appreciate all the more you can run a transect in a grassland. But turns out, as I discovered in this project, you can't leave it out overnight because the cows will come home and they really like to eat measuring tape. So there's that. But just wanted also to draw your attention to that some of the stuff that I'm going to talk to you about today, there's publications that relate to it. So if you want the finer details, the nitty gritty, then I draw your attention to those papers, and there'll be a QR code at the end that'll take you to the publications page for my website where you can get more information on that. And also want to highlight here, I'm going to talk about native grasslands and our sampling in southern Alberta, but also we did focus on cultivated lands, but I wasn't as directly involved in that research. So also you'll see in the lower right slide here, the soil quality and land capability of reclaimed oil and gas well pads in southern Alberta and long-term legacy effects. And so I've just put a little tidbit in here for you because based on my audience here, this could definitely be relevant for you. And so like I said, was not an author on this, but did want to highlight this important work that was done by my postdoc at the time, Dr. Randy Lupardis, as well as project collaborators, Arnold Jans and Ivan Whitson. So just you can see that there's some need for things not getting to where they should be, and that's happening in the cultivated lands as well, but just know that I'm not going to be talking about it today. So you may be asking yourself, what am I going to be talking about? I was tasked to give a presentation with 60 minutes, and 60 minutes in a class goes really fast. I just had one this morning and it's like time's up, and in a seminar setting, in a webinar setting, I'm hoping that feels that way for you as well. So what am I going to talk to you today? Well, if it's a well map or perhaps a road map here, what I'm going to introduce you to are well sites in Alberta. including our reclamation criteria. So very much an Alberta-centric focus here, appreciating that I am presenting to you in Saskatchewan. So you may not be familiar with the process here, just as I'm not very familiar with the process there. And then I'm going to spend time talking about the ERM, or the Ecological Recovery Monitoring Project, that I'm involved in. And I'll talk about our process for deciding, like, what should we measure to quantify recovery of well sites. And you'll see that I'm talking about well sites that have received a reclamation certificate. And then, as my title indicated, we want to assess recovery, and then talk briefly about where do we go from here. So the audience members may or may not be so familiar with the life cycle of a well site. So can appreciate that some of you will be more familiar than others, depending on your background and your context. And I can say, for me, when I joined this project, I came at it from the context that I'd seen a lot of pump jacks growing up in Alberta, including on my drives to Saskatchewan, but also that I didn't really know anything beyond that, that they were pump jacks and what exactly they did. So in the context here, what want to help you appreciate that, you know, we have our, in this case here, we're talking about grasslands. It could be a boreal forest. It could be a cultivated land. So it was doing its regular structure and function, undergoing regular successional processes. And then, you know, there could have been seismic testing to indicate that it looked like a good spot to drill for oil or gas. And so that process requires leveling of the land. Maybe that's less of a concern in some areas, of course, than others. The flat topography piece, you know, there's always the jokes about that if we have to make a turn in the prairies, but there is still some topography. So that does involve leveling and clearing the land, as we can see in this image here. And then we'll see a well may be active or not. It might turn out that it's a dry hole and it's not actually going to warrant production. And so it's going to go through the process of, at some point, then being decommissioned, whether it's been active or not. And remediation had happened at this step if there was any kind of contamination. So that all has to happen. And then the producer then at some point down the road will apply for a reclamation certificate. And this project was really initiated to identify the gap that really, like, what happens to these sites after they receive a reclamation certificate. Because I'm going to share with you the idea that, you know, these are on a positive successional trajectory, what the government calls equivalent land capability, like, are they going back to what they were before? And I don't have to tell this virtual room, right, that this is not the key of just like green is good and, well, it looks green, so it should be good, that it's much more nuanced than that. So that's the piece. That red piece there is going to be what I'm going to highlight here, but just wanted you to appreciate all the other parts of the life of a well as we talk about this in this presentation. Okay. So when you do, this is a scale issue. So when you look at the well sites, and this is a plot map of each individual well site in Alberta. And of course, we're not one giant well site. If you zoom in, you'll appreciate that. So recognizing that, but what we can see is that they are largely across much of Alberta, and we'll see that there are reclamation criteria for forested lands, for cultivated lands, for native grasslands, and as well more recently focusing on wetlands as well. And so I thought we better talk about too, well, what about what's going on in Saskatchewan? And again, not being as familiar at all with what's happening there, but so you could tell me more about that later. But here we can see, for instance, that we have 111,000 as of 2017. I found this report, 111,000 wells, and I didn't see the breakdown there in terms of ones that have been decommissioned or abandoned. So that's when they've been plugged up and they're not going to function anymore, and they're headed towards a reclamation certificate. So not going to go into all the details about Alberta. Again, a lot of similar things to Saskatchewan, except that to the left we have the Rocky Mountains. So different kinds of natural areas in there. But just to draw your attention to where our grasslands area, I'm in Camrose in this area here. I don't know if you actually see my mouse, but I'm over here. And then the grasslands and the areas that we're going to talk about is down here. So I'm in the transition in the parkland zone. So we have features here that are boreal in nature, and then also the grasslands in nature. So we're that transition zone, but the research I'm going to talk about is further south. And so when we look at the grassland subregions, we have a variety of them. In particular, we sampled in the dry mixed grass in this project, the third from the top there, that shading here. You can orient yourself and see where Lethbridge and Medicine Hat are, and then you could think of the equivalents as you go driving east from Medicine Hat of where in Saskatchewan you'll end up. And here on the right, we have the intact grassland. And again, for this audience, I think we know that there's a lot of fragmentation of that grassland, and we can also appreciate just how important that native prairie is for grazing, for wildlife habitat, and for soil and water conservation. And so we can be thinking about the impacts of these seemingly small footprints of a well site. Usually they're about 100 meters by 100 meters. But then if we think about like the cumulative effect of all these postage stamps peppered around, then they could potentially have impacts on the native grassland and its habitat connectivity. So this is where I'm going to focus my energy in this presentation, is talking more to you about our research in this area. So if you've got 100 and some thousand, right, if Alberta is trying to say, well, we've got more, in this case here, when we're talking about well sites, we do, as of the end of last month, according to the Alberta Energy Regulator, AER, there's 468,427. And you can see that these are separated out as a function of whether they're new drillings, whether they're active, inactive, abandoned, or reclaimed. And so the ones that our research is focusing on are the ones at the bottom. So the 29.9, or let's say 30% of them that have received a reclamation certificate. And so we can see that that's a big chunk of them. And this process started back in 1963. So now I'm going to talk, perhaps not the most exciting, to deal with talking about policy, and yet that's very much informs the practices and is essential. So we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about what that looks like, because it is at the level of Alberta, the provincial scale at which these decisions are made for our lands, as long as they're not federal lands. So reclamation is legislated in Alberta, so there is a requirement to conserve. And my colleague, who's now retired, Arnold Jans, who was really instrumental in getting this project going, really emphasized to me always, let's talk about the conservation and the reclamation. So I'm talking here about the reclamation, but the first step should really be, what resources can we conserve? And then the ones that we can't conserve, how do we reclaim those? So industrial lands are required to be reclaimed after they've been decommissioned. And this is through the APIA, or the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, and also the conservation and reclamation regulations. And so here we're talking about upstream oil and gas. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the reclamation certificate criteria, but also appreciate that it's not the most exciting thing to talk about in terms of like the kind of lingo that goes with the government's definition versus, as an ecologist, how to actually measure that. But the idea, right, is that in that life cycle of a well, the well gets decommissioned, as we said, gets abandoned, so it gets plugged so that it can't be operational at all. And then the operators will apply for a reclamation certificate. Basically, that's saying like, yep, we're off. The footprint should be essentially on its way back to what it was before, and it's no longer considered industrial footprint. And so it has to meet the various regulations that are involved. And so I have evolution here, which is a bit of a weasel word because evolution isn't directional. So just think of that in progress here, but that there has been a shift and a change over time to Alberta's regulatory approach to industrial sites. And so initially, you could think about the things that might have been obvious, right? Conservation of topsoil, very much we can appreciate just how important that topsoil is in the prairies, and what happens when it's gone. It's, you're not going to get it back. So there was a big emphasis on that. And so towards that erosion control, protecting those soils, it was like, let's get something growing on it. Let's get it growing quick. And there wasn't a focus on using native species initially. So it was more, let's get something growing, green is good. And in particular, crested wheatgrass was a really prolific choice in the dry mixed grass that I was focusing on in my research. The criteria have changed over time, and I'm not going to share with you because I don't have research sites that are focusing on the 2010 reclamations sites, because these were sampled back in 2013. But they have an increased emphasis on minimizing the cumulative effects and returning the ecological function consistent with adjacent lands rather than just equivalent land capability, and considering more emphasis on native species. And in fact, that is rolled out over time already. So we have progress. And so you could pull up the 2010 reclamation criteria, 2010, but they were updated in 2013. And you can see, right, there's different sort of scenarios here that we can look at. On the pass or fail conditions, they're a function of when the well was constructed, when was it abandoned, and different kinds of considerations here. So for instance, all right, I see a lot of things on in the chat here, but I'm just gonna leave that to somebody else. Just unmute our organizer here if there's anything I need to answer, but we can see, right, the topsoil replacement, pass or fail conditions, and so on and so forth. So different kinds of things, and you could go, wow, that's a little bit confusing potentially. And so really we can think of this in a way, choose your own criteria adventure, not that you're just going to arbitrarily pick, but you have to look at and consider all of these factors in terms of what's happened on your site. And this is part of the challenge too, is that we don't have detailed records on what's happened in all of these sites. And so trying to go back, and in our project, we did a chrono sequence. We substituted space for time. I'll get to that coming up, but you can appreciate the challenges of wanting to know, like, is there different uses, different operators, different who had different practices in place, different seed mixes that they used, that could influence the recovery. But it's just a little bit of a sneak peek about that. Okay, so just a little bit to set the stage a little bit, but keep it not too long here, is that from approximately 1980 to 1993, right, it was the green is good, use grass species to ensure revegetation, but that crested wheatgrass piece was really used. And so you can see in this picture here, right, this line, it's pretty evident that there's something else going on there. And green, right, there's a lot of different shades of green. We just had our St. Patty's Day. We might be thinking about the bright green, but I think, yeah, in the agricultural sector and when we're thinking about grasses, we can appreciate that the shades of green, maybe even our shades of brown in a way. But the idea, right, is that we want to get those back to what they were before, but that's now. But in the past, it wasn't as focused on that. In 1993, the government introduced this idea of equivalent land capability. And so that is the ability of land to support various land uses after conservation and reclamation. It's similar to the ability that existed prior to an activity being conducted on the land, but individual land use is not necessarily identical. So that is like the government criteria. And as an ecologist, when I go look at that, I'm not sure exactly like what that means exactly. So in the context of this project, the ERM project, we use the term ecological recovery to help us to understand that. And what we're trying to say is that we're interested in seeing if they're going back to similar structure and function. You're going to see it in the plant context. I'll talk about taxonomic similarity, but also the traits of those species. Do those matter more than the actual species? So we'll talk a little bit about that. But we could be looking at a variety of different parameters, biological, physical, chemical properties, and that those should be similar to the undisturbed. So that's our take on the interpretation of the equivalent land capability definition there. If we look at the 1995 reclamation criteria, so again, it was towards that ELC or equivalent land capability. And it recognized that, of course, that equivalent land capability, that ecological recovery is going to look very different depending on the kind of land you're working in, where that well site lives, whether that's a cultivated land, a grassland, or a forested land, and then much more recently to a recognition of the peatlands. And the idea here is that you want to apply consistent practices as much as possible, but appreciating that because they are distinct, it's not going to make sense. You're not going to want to plant a bunch of woody species in a grassland, but you are in a forest. And historically, that didn't all turn out that way. But we'll leave the boreal for a discussion another day. This too, in terms of sampling and what the control is, of course, when we talk about experimental design, when we talk about observational studies and design, and we can appreciate just how much variation. And I think this audience more than most, because I think a lot of people might look out in a field and go, okay, yeah, well, it's a field, it's grasses. And you appreciate the nuance of like, well, it's not just that it's grass, it's that, it actually matters which grasses are there. And so there's going to be a lot of variation depending on the soil type, and for a wide variety of other parameters there. So it was important to recognize the need to have a control adjacent to the site. And also here, it was recommended to be seeded to native species, not necessarily the same species as offsite in what was adjacent, but that would be helpful as well. And so there was a detailed site assessment report, documentation of the landscape, soils and vegetation that could be verified on site. And over time, the practices have also shifted that it's very much a desk submission. And so not a lot of practitioners, auditors from AER, say, going out to the individual sites to see this. It's more of a submission that is submitted online, say. So as I said, I'm not going to focus on these criteria in my presentation, but the 2010 reclamation criteria, the current ones, do bring in range management tools, and also that, again, that industrial disturbance should be reclaimed to equivalent of the adjoining plant community. So paying more attention to the specifics of the what's next door. But I work in the sites pre-2010, so I'm not the one to ask for a lot about a lot of the details on this here. But if you can see in this image here, this one, I think there was a pipeline that was in here that you don't notice it as much anymore. Okay. All right. So going back to then that life cycle of the well, as I already mentioned, right, there's the different phases, and the closing the gap is what this ecological recovery monitoring project is about. And that is closing that gap of like, what happens to these sites? So they receive a reclamation certificate, but nobody ever goes back, right? So the idea is that it's on a positive successional trajectory to what it was before, but is it? That's a big gap in knowledge, and something that hasn't historically been looked at here in Alberta. Be curious to hear what happens in Saskatchewan, but here big gaps. So part of this then, the impetus was we had Arnold Jams reach out to us from the government of Alberta, asking ABMI to like help to address this gap. And so starting points for our project, including like basic things like what should we measure? And then also we want to have a sense of how effective are the historic reclamation practices? Are they actually getting back to what they were before, if that's the intent of the reclamation criteria? And if they are working and they are getting back, how long does this take, right? I deal a lot more in forests, and 100-year-old forest, you can follow the age, you can core the trees in a boreal forest to get that. Grasslands can be trickier, but again, there's like the different species we expect to see at different stages of succession. And then also could we potentially apply the information that we're learning in our project to help to inform the current reclamation criteria, recognizing that there's already been progress and change in what's being done, and not enough time yet though to properly evaluate that. Although we'll see in where do we go from here, that ideally if we could monitor sites from time zero and have all the detailed records, that would really help us with the project. So today here, I'm sharing with you a little bit about this ERM project, the Ecological Recovery Monitoring Project, that, as I said, was started back in 2012 with ABMI working with the government, and various iterations of it that including things that became arm's length, like AMIRA, but that's besides the point. The bigger picture here is to highlight that the goal was that we were approached with the goal to develop a long-term, scientifically robust, and financially sustainable monitoring program to assess ecological recovery at certified reclaimed sites across Alberta. So of course, there's a lot of other things that industrial disturbances we could have focused on, but we wanted to start with well sites. Pipelines, that they're long, continuous, they have their own challenges. So this was seemingly picking off something that was attainable. you'll notice that we've highlighted scientifically robust, right? But also financially sustainable, because, you know, if there's a parameter that we think is really important to measure, but it costs, you know, $1,000 a sample, is it realistic that we could actually do that? So you have to put together all the different pieces and considering that. So this project involved a 3-year field-based project, field sampling, and I'll talk more about that. And appreciating that well sites, they take time and we can't pick where they are. It was very much a retrospective observational study, substituting space for time to look at the recovery patterns with the criteria and recognizing that the criteria have changed over time from the get something grower to avoiding the non-natives in our newer sites. So the first step, what we needed to do was actually to develop the monitoring protocols. And there is another publication that we have that has the detailed how we actually measured these sites. So if you in your context are looking at trying to set up a monitoring program, maybe it's not, you're interested, you're learning about this in the well site context, but it doesn't actually, that's not my disturbance, that's not what I'm interested in. You could still find the value in setting those up because it has the model of sampling well sites, so you can pick whatever your disturbance is, so sampling that and then in an adjacent reference condition. So we developed our monitoring protocols, and those were very much based to working with the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, which samples across 1,656 sites across the province. Not sure if Saskatchewan has any monitoring program that's similar to that, but that's their project, and which is why the government reached out to them, because they are experts in monitoring. So today I'm going to share with you some of what we found for the native grasslands, which we sampled in 2013. So we just sampled 18 well sites and adjacent reference. So keep that also too, right? Sample size challenges, and there's always lots of learning to do, but you want to start out at a pilot phase rather than just launch a full giant program. So you want to test things out, see what works, what doesn't work, and then go from there. But we did also sample the forested lands, and as I mentioned before, there's the paper that I pointed out to you for cultivated lands that were sampled in 2015, and there were 25 of those sites. So in terms of what do you actually measure? Well, as you can appreciate, there's a lot of different things that you can measure. You could measure a lot of soil data, and you can measure a lot of vegetation data. You could measure like wildlife habitat use. You could put out acoustic recording units. You could put out wildlife cameras. It all comes down to what it is that you actually want to focus on. So part of our discussions included considering the various criteria that we should think about in terms of what we should measure. So we drew together government and industry experts to be on our part of our advisory group to help guide us in this, because as an ecologist, I have certain things that I think are important, but I have to make sure that those align and that they meet the needs. So we have to be thinking about things like the sensitivity or the variability, right? If something's going to be really noisy, are we going to pick up a signal? Does it make sense to measure that? Probably not. The ease at which we can measure it. So if something requires like a really fancy piece of equipment, and or maybe not even so fancy, but it doesn't work so well, is that the way to go? For instance, we tried to measure penetration resistance out in the grasslands, and we ran into lots of problems with the equipment not working. Also, that the data that you collected was specific to that particular instrument, and so transferability amongst a different model in that one, they weren't very comparable. So that wasn't very helpful. And then again, the cost of the equipment, but also the measurement, the analysis, soil sampling, for instance, right? There's a lot of different parameters we can get with the soil cores we collect, but then of course we have to consider that there's limited resources in order to be able to do that. And then, ideally things that were relevant across Alberta, across the different land types, recognizing that there's going to be different things that we measure on a cultivated land, right? Crop yield isn't going to make sense in the context of a boreal forest, say. And just is the sampling destructive? Well, we have the soil sampling will be destructive to a degree, but we obviously don't want to collect a whole bunch of plant samples that then change the trajectory of that site. And if methodology already exists and is practical and meets the other criteria, then let's do that rather than reinvent the wheel. And then also interested in the timing or seasonality there piece too, of like, you know, sampling, is this something that can be achievable within the peak growing season, say for sampling the plants, say. Okay. Oh, I'm just looking, so there's some questions here. Do you want me to answer these questions as we go? I just noticed these questions, open questions, or leave them for the end. I'm looking to my moderator here.
Yeah, it's up to you, but we could just leave them to the end, might be best.
Okay. And I'll just actually, the quick of that, I see Sagars do barley as a potential crop for saline soils used in land reclamation. Not something I'm familiar with. I haven't worked in the saline soils myself. And so just a note too, that if there was some kind of salinity contamination piece going on, that has to be remediated before it gets a reclamation certificate. So I don't deal with those. And then a pre-assessment. How many sites have these done? I don't have the exact numbers, Jason. I have to go back and look, but we didn't have the PDAs for very many of our sites. And that's a limitation of our study, knowing that, yeah, there's challenges there that the story probably starts out with what the actual practices were in the beginning. So that's a limitation. And we'll see, we have to add in a site level random term to account for some of that in our analysis. Okay, back to this. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so just what I'm going to share with you today then is in our grassland site. So we've got sites that we sampled that were about 10, 20, 30 years post-certification. And then when we did some of the analysis, in particular, I should acknowledge Dr. Randy Lepardis, my postdoc, who did a lot of the analyses on this. We found it was meaningful to lump them, that there wasn't big differences between the 20 and 30 years for a lot. They were with the older criteria. So we've then you'll see in some of the analyses that I'm going to show you that we lump those together as part of the older, or you'll see old criteria. And then we have the newer criteria, but just remember, those aren't the new as in the 2010 criteria. They're not the current ones. They're the ones that predate the current ones. So we can go down on a virtual field trip here down to southern Alberta. And so we sampled 18 sites across those 3 age classes, trying to have a balanced design, and also having to consider things like that they were similar, like loamy eco site, fairly level topography, that they didn't have any major disturbance happening next door to them. They were public grazing leases to help to account for the impacts that different grazing intensities might have, and so on and so forth. So I'm just highlighting some of these indicators that we ended up selecting, and for vegetation and for soils here, but recognizing that those vary depending on which type of site we're looking at. So we're just focusing on the grasslands here. So we sampled taxonomic vegetation. So we set up a bunch of quadrats to sample, and you'll see I have a visual to highlight how those were sampled, but systematic locations, the idea being that we could go back to these sites over time as well and monitor them potentially. And so having systematic locations would be helpful for that. And as well, we did a species census. So we have our estimates of actual cover by species, but then also how many other species did we potentially miss? So we did timed fixed area presence absence within each of the 4 quadrants of our, like I said, approximately 100 meter by 100 meter or 1 hectare well sites. And just a reminder, we didn't do any rangeland health assessment, and that's something that that is more being used now than it was before. So at the time, that was our focus, and I'll say that we've shifted over time and leveraged the opportunity that when we're out there and we're collecting data at the species level, that definitely is one story, but the individual species are, can be very regional. And so it can be of interest too, to think more generally than just about the taxonomy of the individual species. And so we were interested in the functional traits. So that's something that we've been working on more recently with these sites. And so you may be familiar with functional traits, but maybe not, because fair enough, that was something that was new for me. But the idea here, what we're talking about as a plant, these are traits for the plants in particular. And we're looking at morphological, physiological, or phenological features that are measurable at the individual level, from the cell to the whole organism level without reference to the environment or any other level of organization. So of course, some traits are going to be more plastic than others. And so we can also think about traits in the context of are they responding to what's happening, or are they affect traits and they're actually contributing to the response of other things in a community system and how the ecosystem functions. And so there's a list. I appreciate the irony of it being a tree here for the grassland, but I like that it lists some of the particular traits that it might be thinking about, like the specific leaf area or the leaf carbon content, the specific root lengths, things like that, properties of the seeds as well. What's their mode of dispersal? You could be thinking about things like the shade tolerance. Again, shade tolerance probably not such a factor in the grasslands compared to when we're looking in the plants in a boreal forest. And so just to give you an idea of some of the traits that we were interested in our study, and I'm not going to read these all out, but these are things, so to be clear, we didn't collect these at the individual sites. Instead, what we did was we used the database from the Traits of Plants in Canada. That's a government database that has a ton of resources, lots of information on lots of species. And so we picked some of the traits, and then we looked at those based on the plants that were observed in our sites. And I don't want to, this is taken from our paper, but just to highlight, right, that there's a lot of different steps that go into looking at all these traits. So we put together the various species and the sites, and we can look at the community weighted mean values, like based on the relative abundance of individual species and various traits. And we can do lots of fancy stat stuff that I'm grateful that Dr. Luparz took the lead on, but just to give you a bit of a sense, and you can find this in our paper. So soils, you're probably excited to hear about soils. And that being said, it was sort of a consistent kinds of findings that we found. So I'm not going to tell you about all of them, but we can say that we did collect, we were pretty exhaustive, I would say, with our soil sampling, because we collected 108 for each well site. That included the adjacent reference, and I'll show you a visual coming up here. And we picked depths. We couldn't sample based on horizons, right? These have been disturbed soils. You all know how the pace at which pedogenesis happens. And so we used the depths rather that align with the depths that are used in the depths that are used in the criteria. So the 0 to 15, the 15 to 30, the bulk density was only done on those two. As it was our bulk density soil sampler, we had to get pretty creative with using physics to leverage to get it back out of the ground. And so then we used a trowel for the deeper samples, so 30 to 60 and 60 to 100, and measured the attributes minus the bulk density for those. And we also did some particle size analysis, but it ended up being pretty expensive and not so helpful. So not gonna tell you more about that. But in terms of part of the process was developing before we got out to the site. So, what are we going to measure? Okay, these are the plant things we're going to measure. These are the soil things that we're going to measure. Then we have to be thinking strategically about where we're going to place those, recognizing that the most disturbed site is expected to be at the center of the well site, where the drill would have, the hole would have been drilled. We wanted to make sure that we sampled there. And then we were systematic with our locations in each quadrant and going out so far. And just a reminder too, because some people are tempted to want to just like separate out and compare within the site the differences, but our sample unit in our data is pooling those and looking at the patterns overall, but trying to capture the various aspects. And we're within more of like what's called the teardrop area, where most of the disturbance happens, rather than sampling out all the way to the edge with our soil samples, say. So they're more interior rather than all the way out to the edge of about the 100 meters. And then you can see the adjacent reference grassland. We went out in each direction to sample in the adjacent reference as well. And of course, we had to move things around if we ran into some challenges along the way, like that there was a pipeline that hadn't shown up before. So then obviously we weren't going to go sample there, because then it wouldn't be a representative control, if you will, our reference. Okay, as I said, we lump those together, the 12 older, the 6 newer, and I already mentioned the challenges, like we tried to control as much variability as we could, but recognizing to Jason's question there that there was limited knowledge of the disturbance and reclamation history for individual sites. So we tried to control as much as we could that with limitation. So a little bit of like a virtual field trip. Again, it's going to be much more. You probably wish you could be there and zoom in to see what it is that's actually there. We'll talk a little bit more about that when I show you some of the plant results. But we have here, this is the oldest criteria. So these were the oldest sites that we sampled. And what you see over here on the left here is a lot of crested wheatgrass. So there are a lot. That was very dominant. And we'll see that. Here's 20 years post-certification. Definitely seeing like on the well sites, some dandelions amongst the green. And here is the newer. So that's the catches. I think at that first glance, you look at those and you go, okay, I don't know what I'm actually seeing, except that I can tell you that it was a lot of crested wheatgrass in the 2 older criteria age categories there. So we finally are at the point there, hopefully, we set the stage in terms of what did we actually find in these sites that we sampled. And so just to highlight a little bit of the differences, again, bulk density, we could only sample the first 30 centimeters of depth. And so this isn't based on horizon. If you look at these graphs, you have bulk density as your y-axis, age class. So here we're separating out rather than combining the newer and the older. So remember, the 10s are the newers, the 20 and the 30s are the older. And what we can see, though, the different letters at the top indicate significant differences. So the well sites, in the case of both depths, the bulk density is higher on the well sites than the reference. Not like double or anything like that, but even after reclamations happen, there is still that soil compaction that's happened. If we look at the plant, and we saw similar patterns for some of the others. I have a bunch of graphs at the end if anyone ever wanted to look at them, but I didn't want to throw a million graphs at you showing you the same thing over and over. But here I can show you the plant taxonomic composition. So if we're looking at the individual species level on the over on the graph to the left, we can see the species richness in the reference versus the new wells and the old wells. And so these are box plots. Hopefully you're familiar with those, but the data are not always normal. So we decided to show box plots in this context here instead. So the middle bar is the median value, and we don't have the means on these. So could always show those to you, but I don't have those handy here because this is related to our publication that came out in 2020. And then if you're familiar, right, so we can't just, if we just focus on richness, we might think, okay, we're not doing too bad in the wells. And there were no significant differences, in fact, in either of these. But if we look at the Simpsons diversity, right, higher value is more diverse. So we're looking at the relative contributions of the various species of those, however many species were on an individual site. And overall, we can see, even though not significant here, higher diversity in the reference compared to the new wells are better, closer. We don't get as low, but in the Simpsons, and we can imagine like the crested wheatgrass as a contributor to the story that we get here with a lot of the lower diversity. And we can see that the Shannon diversity here, when we separate out rather than combine into the new and the old, we do see the significant differences in terms of the Shannon diversity. And again, that's just a measure that incorporates not just the richness, but the relative abundance of the species too. So the idea being here that if you have 10 species on a site, and you have one of them crested wheatgrass and the others, right, that's basically 90%, and all the others are really small amounts, then you're going to have really a much lower diversity than if you had more equal or even contribution percent cover of each of those 10 species, then that's going to be represented with a higher diversity value. And so we can definitely see the distinction there in that diversity. So in this graph here, going to show you what's called a non-metric multidimensional scaling, or NMDS ordination. That was followed by a permanova. And if you're not a stats person, that's okay. Don't expect you to. All you need to know is that actually that the axes are meaningless. And points closer together on this plot are more similar than points that are further away. And each point here represents a site. And what it represents is like either a reference or a well site in each of those 18 sites. So there should be 36 points on this graph here, and each one represents then the collective community composition for that particular site, so that well site or that reference sample. So when we go back to thinking about that grid and our systematic locations of our quadrants, this is capturing that at an individual point to represent the community, rather than looking at a particular individual species one at a time. Okay, so what we hopefully can see too is when we can see that there's actually a lot of variation across like the older sites, like they're not all clumped together. But what we do notice is that there is an overlap with the reference sites. So those are separate. And what we see as the newer sites, those are actually, some of them are overlapping. Some are overlapping with the older, but they're closer, they're on the closer side compared to the reference. And so what we can see here, right, is like what's happening with those older sites is that in fact, yeah, it's the crested wheatgrass in the older sites that's contributing to them being separate. And they were all considered to have different plant community compositions, looking at their taxonomic here. And in the newer sites, there's an abundance of Western wheatgrass that's been used. And so that shows up as one of the species that's an indicator in that group. And then associated with the reference, we have the needle and thread grass, and then the blue grama grass at the top there. So those are some of the native species that come out in the reference sites. Okay, and then so what did we find with the plant functional traits? So I'll just give you a chance to look at this a little bit, but also appreciate it's sort of trying to summarize a lot of complex multivariate analysis on the plant functional traits all at once. But what we can see, right, maybe draw your attention in the upper right to the arrested succession piece, right, that it doesn't look like that recovery is happening as much with the older criteria. And so if we look at not the species in particular, but the traits of them, we see in the 30-year-old sites, we have plants with traits like that they were introduced, they're non-native, things that are high seed producers, they're dispersed by animals, and they prefer mesic conditions. And this is in contrast if we look at the traits for our reference plants, which are also associated with lower values of with pH and bulk density. They're short in stature, they're native, they're preferred for xeric, which makes sense because we were sampling in the dry mixed grass natural subregion. They have semi-abundant seed production, large seed weights. And then if we look at the newer sites at the bottom here that were reclaimed using the newer criteria, we can see that we have the plant traits for them being tall, low dispersal capacity, therophytes, geophytes, having a hydric preference, which is interesting. But basically, it's not just like that a species is native or not native that matters, but like the traits of them appear to matter as well. So that was an interesting finding that the functional diversity can tell us more than just the taxonomic information can. And I tried to do a quick summary slide here to sort of highlight what some of our findings were. But for instance, we had like higher bulk density, higher electrical conductivity for all depths, and all the soil indicators that we measured had some difference amongst the well site and reference for at least one of the depths. And going forward, I think, we recommended more that like probably don't have to have 108 soil samples in order to tell this, and maybe we should just focus on more of the surface soils going forward, because 108 soil samples in terms of efficiency of sampling, that alone takes a lot of time. So vegetation, right, decrease in species richness on the well site and diversity, not always significant, as we saw in the graphs that we just looked at. Overall lower vegetation cover on those well sites, and the cover that's there is higher non-native, and that is more so in the sites that are the older sites than the newer sites. We don't have that crested wheatgrass. That being said, in a reference to that crested wheatgrass, it hasn't done dramatic expansion outside of that original footprint, but we did pick it up in some of our sites as well. So we can see long-lasting impacts in terms of what we found. And just also remember that this is just 18 sites. So just also a note of caution, because I always warn my students, beware of scope of inference. And so we don't want to generalize out. These sites were not randomly selected. So we just have to be a bit cautious there. But this does point towards that the newer practices, they're on a trajectory that is more towards the current reference than the older sites. And I'm not going to show you more than this here, but just to highlight too that there is a lot of work in terms of thinking about new tools, and remotely sensed vegetation data is impressive, the amount that we can learn from drones and satellites and all that good stuff. But here, I just think it's interesting. If you look at, this is the site, right, that was spudded in 92, certified in 2001, and we can still see, right, in that image, just like where that well site must have been. So that we do see that. And on the right, we have the spectral image of like the greenness, and that helps to capture that. But definitely we can see, right, that legacy and that impact there. But that's beyond the scope also of what I'm involved in this project, but just wanted to draw your attention to it. So to wrap up, and time is going fast, as I guess it's like my class, like, time's almost up. But good place to end is like, where do we go from here? So I do want to highlight that this was very much a pilot study. We learned a lot. We developed protocols. Those protocols are very much transferable to other places, other types, potentially, without without it being a well site necessarily. Different kinds of, like a linear transect, like a pipeline, would have different applications on how you'd sample it. But you might think about that we did find that we did pick up signals of difference. And so that gives us some confidence too, that these are the right kind of indicators. And we did gain a lot towards addressing our knowledge gaps. Our goal remains, to a degree, to develop a long-term monitoring program. With that being said, we have ABMI monitoring on a bigger scale, not specific to particular land use types. And our current budget there is no budget for this project in the government right now. So there's a challenge, but doesn't mean that there isn't value in it, but there isn't a buy-in for the government to fund it. So there is money being allocated to oil and gas reclamation right now, and I don't know the details on this because I just heard about it, like it being in the news, but there's pilot projects to speed up the reclamation, but I haven't heard anything about any interest in terms of like what happens to them after the reclamation certificate. So we've got a little bit of insight from what we've learned here, right? We think that the plant species composition and the traits can help us to better understand the recovery process. And of course, we don't want to forget the soils, which they are very important as well. Just that for us, the challenges of like the sampling and processing of those is more complex. And so there's trade-offs there, but we absolutely should still measure those as well. So just more of the plant person, but recognizing definitely the monitoring should include the soils as well, just not 108 samples and not necessarily going as deep. But we need to do more. We need more research here. And we have to appreciate a lot of challenges. And in general, monitoring is not something that people get very excited about. Funding cycles, graduate student cycles, trying to get funding for a sustained long-term program is really challenging. The biggest grants are 5 years long, so that is a challenge. And of course, we just sampled in the dry mixed grass. We tried to control as much noise as possible in our study. And at the same time, right, then we're just honed in on one particular area. And there's all the other grasslands. There's all the other areas even that we haven't looked at. So there's so much still to learn. And I think it requires us all coming together and having buy-in, having the resources. And it's no easy feat. And I can appreciate the challenges that the government has with having to manage all of the various objectives. And so can appreciate that there's only so many finite resources to spread around right now. So just want to close, right, to highlight, so we've started to address the post-certification knowledge gaps, but we're not there yet, right? There are still remain the questions in terms of what can we do? There's potential technologies that we're still just learning about. I think we're pretty confident about what indicators we think we should measure. We've got some insights to reclamation practices, but a long ways to go. And we should put more emphasis too on the current ones now that enough time has passed. We can ideally even start those from time 0. We still don't know how long it takes for some, right? There was no clear evidence that like, yep, we're there, they're all recovered. It takes a long time. And, you know, the jury's still out on how we could use this information, like, without having all the information on the news site. So we're just, you know, this is a start. You got to start somewhere, but there's a long ways to go. And hopefully through this presentation, you've appreciated the complexity and challenges. Well, you already appreciated the complexities and challenges of the grasslands, but how to quantify and close that knowledge gap from receiving the reclamation certificate of, is it actually going back to being a reference and or not, and when does that happen? So with that, I will close, and I do have a few minutes left here for questions. I've got the QR code there that'll point you to my website, and you're welcome to reach out via email as well. And I see we do have a question here, or from Mary Lou. Grasslands is a community of native grasses, sagebrush, and wildflowers. Is there any interest in including sagebrush as part of reclamation plantings? Oh, that's a great question. And I have to say too that I'm one, so I'm not involved in the actual reclamation piece. I'm involved in like what happens afterwards and informing that. But I love these ideas, right, of can we use native seed mixes? Can we get more creative with what we're actually planting out there? I absolutely think we should. But that is not an area that I get to work on. But I think that it sounds really interesting and exciting.
I would say sagebrush would just come in naturally if it's in the area.
Okay.
No need to plant it.
No need to plant it. Okay. What about in areas where if it's not, like, does it make sense to bring it into areas where it isn't currently?
Probably not. The rancher wouldn't wouldn't want it. They prefer, you know, palatable grasses. So
Right. Okay. Okay, and then there's another question here. How does high soil bulk density and EC, electrical conductivity, contribute to environmental stress on vegetation? So that's a great question, Shabnam. The challenge, of course, with this study is like it's an observational study, and it's always like when we go to publish, right, we have to like delete that. This is driving this, and this is connected to the. So we can look for associations and patterns. And I'd point you to the paper that if you go to that ScanMe, the Lupartis ecological engineering paper, because what I didn't have time to present was our detailed redundancy analysis, which is not at all redundant, right? But where we're constraining our variables, our vegetation patterns, based on, and in this case here, the functional traits based on those various attributes, including the soils. So then you could look at that more carefully, but I don't have time to answer that in detail here, but also could feel free to reach out afterwards as well. And then I've got a question here from Balwinder. Possible reason for decreasing species richness and increase in non-native vegetation. So that goes back, Balwinder, to the historic reclamation practices, right? The green is good. Non-native seed mixes were the norm. The crested wheatgrass in particular was the go-to. And so that's where that came in. So it really, right, it once it's in, it's a really good competitor, right? It does a good job of basically like, yeah, running the show and not letting other things in. It tolerates drought better. It outcompetes the other species. And so if you set it up and you establish it, the other native species struggle to be able to get back in the competition because it's been rigged in advance of them. So that's one of the reasons there.
Yeah, I have a quick question. I was just wondering if you found any, when you were looking for sites, were these all orphan wells or abandoned sites, or were they they still have owners?
No, so that's the catch. So these are all had a good point of clarification there. So these were all sites that had received a reclamation certificate. So those abandoned orphan wells, right? Like they're all like sitting in limbo. They haven't gone back to what they were, right? They're sitting in a state of like not good. These ones were all, yeah, they'd received a reclamation certificate. And so the idea is that they had met the criteria. And so, yeah, they weren't,
they still have owners though, do you know? Like
so there's still liability from the operators, like that is, I think, in perpetuity, but don't quote me on that. I forget the details. Like if something were to come up with a contamination, but no, they've reverted back, like they're back to what they were, like the farmer's land, the grassland. In our case, we focused just on public grazing lands, right? Because if we had that added potential noise of grazing intensity for different landowners might have different intensities with which they with which they graze, and we didn't want that to confound our results.
Oh, sounds good. I guess that's time.